In the case of the man I'm currently exorcising, there is, when he comes in to the church, we do the exorcisms only in the church and only at times when there's nobody around. And I'll tell you about the process we use. But we start with him lying flat on his stomach on the floor. Because to start with him in a chair, there's not enough people that can hold him down. What happens in the course of the praying the solemn rite, it stimulates the demonic. Sometimes he's already beginning to be stimulated even before he gets in the church. But once the demons start to be stimulated and start to manifest, his voice will change dramatically. This particular individual had some history dealing with martial arts. So the voices that will begin to come out of him have kind of a martial arts tone to them, almost like a martial arts ritual. And then he will begin to speak in a variety of languages. He might be speaking Latin, or they might be speaking something we don't quite understand, but it's clearly a language. Or then he'll speak in English and say what he's going to do to us or what he won't do in terms of the compliance of the commands to tell us your name. There'll be the rolling of the eyes. His tongue will move in a very agitated way, like a serpent or a reptile, something you'd see on Animal Planet. The inordinate strength kind of goes with the territory. Those would be the manifestations we would definitely see, even though he's prone on the floor, because we're all up there very close to him. And until we finally got to the point of putting him on the floor, we would start with him in a chair, and those same manifestations would occur: the rolling of the eyes, the drooling, the language. Then, of course, the just strength. That he's 35 years old and he's a built guy, but I mean, we have 5 people who are also very qualified to hold him down and have a very hard time. That's why we went to the floor, for everybody's safety, including his. So in Rome, I would see those kinds of things. But again, every case, every person manifests with some variation. So, for example, I remember Carmen had a brother and sister come who had been involved in the occult. And these guys were both in their mid to late 20s. And the mom would bring them. And they would howl. They would begin to cough. And the cough is usually a sign of deliverance. And it's not like clearing your throat cough. It's not like I have a bad cold, like we got a lot of folks with flu cough. It's a kind of cough that it doesn't stop. And it doesn't stop because the prayers are not only stimulating the demon, they're delivering the demon. And so what happens oftentimes in a deliverance, because demons enter through the senses, the ears, the nose, the mouth, and the eyes. Very, very often, part of the deliverance you will see happen, not just with the agitation of the limbs, but it's with this coughing that then produces a kind of foaming at the mouth. It's not like shaving cream foam, but it clearly is, it's foaming at the mouth. And you know, that's just one example where the coughing would begin, the rolling of the eyes would happen, and then they would begin to howl. They would begin to howl like they were 2 wolves. And this could go on for half an hour, 45 minutes. I was only with Father Carmen for 3+ months. I don't think they were delivered, but I do know that he did deliver things out of them. He did deliver some demonic entities, but he wasn't through. Because there's never one demon. There's always a gang. That's what we call them. At least that's what I was taught. They're a gang. It's like a pride of lions or a herd of cows. We call it a gang of demons. And there's always one that's in charge, and there's always a hierarchy, because there's a hierarchy of demons to begin with, because they parallel the angels. Never had nightmares. I've never been afraid. It has to be a grace, and I'm not being overly pietistic. It has to be a grace, because I'm not. I've never been. I'd say the first few days with Carmen in Rome, when I would see these manifestations, which I'd never ever observed before, I kept wondering, is this a placebo effect? Are these people thinking that this is the way they're supposed to act? And then after about, first week anyway, when I kept seeing the same manifestations, I just assumed this was the real deal, that they weren't faking it. And then Carmen would fill me in a little bit. His English was, I knew more Italian than he knew English. So we would bring a translator in every few weeks, and I would go home at night after every session, and I would journal. What did I see today? And specifically, what did I see today I've never seen before? And then I would identify who this person was, blah, blah, blah. And then every few weeks we'd sit down and I'd say, why did you do this? Why did you do that? What does that mean? And with this Italian man who was living with the Capuchin priest, he was a layman. He was a teacher of English as a second language. That's how I largely learned, was the observation and then the follow-up with all the questions. I think that the initial answer I can give to that is that we have an authoritative ritual. So that, to me, is really what most distinguishes Roman Catholicism and our approach to the demonic from every other, whether he or she be a freelance exorcist or someone who's directly connected to another ecclesial body. We have an authoritative ritual. The Orthodox also have an authoritative ritual. And what distinguishes Roman Catholicism from the Orthodox insofar as the practice of exorcism is that in their tradition, every priest is deputized to be an exorcist. In our tradition, the bishop is the chief exorcist of the diocese by right of his ordination, and he can deputize someone like me to so do that. Or he can deputize someone else on the spot and say, this is an ad hoc case, I need you to go and deal with it. But I would say that would be the thing, that would be the point of demarcation. That would be the easiest one to differentiate, would be the fact we have an authoritative ritual that goes back to 1614. On the team with whom I work, I have a prayer team that's separate from the professionals. The prayer team are with me at every exorcism and every major deliverance. And they're there to help in the discernment of what we're observing and how we're praying and what's going on during the actual formal exorcism, or if it's a deliverance, which is not a formal exorcism. The medical doctor, clinical psychologist, and psychiatrist are not present for any of those rituals or prayer experiences. However, they're part of the discernment that will lead up to what is the approach that we need to take. When someone calls me and I agree to see them, when they meet, we usually meet in the parlor here, just as for the initial conversation, meeting, etc. After some initial prayer, I will say, what's brought you here today? And I will have them tell me what the event or pattern of events have been that's caused them to seek an exorcist. And then I'll say, when did that experience or set of experiences first begin? Because I always assume and I tell them this up front, I always assume that they're telling me what's real for them. And I'm not there to deny it or to debunk it. But my role is to get to the root cause of what they're suffering from. And I want to underline suffering, because that's true for almost every single person who comes to me, whether they have mental health issues, preternatural issues, or both, or something other than. They're suffering. And so my role is to get to the root cause of the suffering. And so I will, in the course of the listening, I'm always listening for doorways. And then I will follow up with a whole battery of questions in terms of, tell me about what was it like growing up in your home. Tell me about your religious background, if you have one, whether it's Catholic or otherwise, because I don't see just Catholics. Tell me about any history of involvement in the occult. Ouija boards, tarot cards, seances, palm readings, mediums, white magic, black magic, spells, whatever. Meditation, whatever. Any history of addictions, drugs, alcohol, food, gambling, pornography. Any history of sexual abuse. 80% of the people who come to me are sexual abuse victims. Now, as I said yesterday, that doesn't mean that 80% of our society are sexual abuse victims, but it means that the vast majority, and 80 is not really loose because it just depends. I can go for 6 months and everybody comes to me as a sexual abuse victim. Then I might go for a while and nobody is. But I'd say about 8 out of 10 are. And then, tell me about the history of your family. Have you associated with people who have ever been involved in the occult or the satanic? And sometimes their responses will cause me to ask other kinds of questions, because I'm always, like I spoke yesterday, I'm always listening for doorways, openings. Where might a demon or a demonic spirit, have somehow entered into and attached possibly to their body or their life? One of the ways in which we sort of test that out, I will always do some deliverance prayer with them on the first session. And then based on listening for doorways, sometimes it's really clear. Sometimes people have done all kinds of dangerous stuff. Sometimes people will start manifesting in the parlor. I've had that happen a few times. I'll walk in, and the power of holy orders is enough that it'll actually threaten the demon. The person will just start acting out all over the place. So depending on what happens might depend on the degree to which I might send them to our clinical psychologist for an evaluation. If I don't hear any doorways, more likely than not, I will send them to the therapist. Occasionally, I might say, why don't you come back? How about, if you're a Catholic, do you worship on a regular basis? Is to get them into a regimen to kind of build them up. It's like when someone goes to their physician and their resistance is low. And you might give them antibiotics, or you might put them on a vitamin regimen or whatever. So if they're Catholic and really aren't connected to the church, I'll say you need to get back into a rhythm of a faith life and a spiritual life. So regular Eucharist weekly, monthly confession, daily prayer, and start doing that let's try that for a couple, 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then come see me in a month. Let's make a date. And then what I'll do is what happened in the last month. Now, if there's manifestations, I will call the therapist and say, I'm going to send someone to you, and this is what I observed. And it's really to get an affirmation in either way. But one is, when I'm seeing some of the signs myself, I'm not going to go launching into an exorcism. An exorcism is the very last thing exorcist does. But I certainly would create a schedule where we would do deliverance prayer on a regular basis and see between that and the sacraments if that is enough to be able to free the person from the demonic. In my exorcism world, possession refers to a condition, a demonic condition in which a demon has taken full control over someone's body, but the person is still resisting. Integration would be where the person has chosen to accept the demon. So a full possession is relatively rare. Far more often, I end up, if there is a demonic condition, the terms are oppression, obsession, and sometimes I'll throw the one in called harassment, where there's something going on, but there doesn't seem to be a demonic. It seems to be something that's from the outside trying to affect the person rather than on the inside. I tend to use the word attachment because that's much more tangible than oppression and obsession. Sometimes exorcists will use the words interchangeably. But oppression usually refers to a kind of depression where the person has a hard time functioning, but still can function, in either case, oppression or obsession, at a level where they can hold a job, raise a family, drive a car, basically do what you and I do, but with difficulty. An obsession is where usually there's psychotic experiences of hearing voices, seeing demons, maybe going through periods of what we would call disassociation, to one degree or another. That's why I tend to use attachment. I just find that's far more real than these terms that, what do they mean to the average person? And even sometimes to the exorcist, depending on which exorcist you're talking to, they might mean different things. So those would be the the difference is. A possession is where demon's taken full control. Usually with people who are fully possessed, they can't function. They can't take care of themselves. They can't drive a car. They're not really competent. It's a topic that almost nobody knows anything about. Everybody has an opinion on, and everyone has an emotional reaction to. I just spoke at San Jose State. Now, I've spoken to lots of colleges and lots of other places around the country. I mean, it takes me away from here. I try and go one day and fly out one day, fly back the next, because A, it takes a lot of time, but B, it helps educate and catechize and inform people. But on the other side of the coin, I think one of the reasons, there's two reasons why I think that institution of the United States has probably been, reticent about saying too much about the topic. I think one, I can speak with some empirical information. The other one is more of an opinion. I think on the one hand, bishops in general are very afraid. I think the sexual abuse scandal, I mean, that was a major, major torpedo hit, if you want to use a metaphor of a ship as the church. We took a monster, monster hit. And I think in my years as a priest, since that, there continue to be a lot of aftershocks. And the aftershocks come really in the form of additional scandals. There was a huge one that was just reported on by the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about a priest in Bridgeport who was the rector of the cathedral, who was a very popular guy, and who got involved in being a meth dealer and basically being a male prostitute. So that just hit the New York Times last week. And he is connected to tons of hierarchy in the United States. So every time one of these things happen, as we're getting off the mat and one more of these things occur, it just only makes, I think, the hierarchy in general hunker down that much more. So when you bring the notion of the demonic up, it's like, we don't know what to do with that. I mean, in general, there's very few bishops who even know very much about the ministry of exorcism, which is, there isn't any bishop today who wasn't ordained after the Second Vatican Council. So this stuff is not even taught in the seminaries. And I've tried as best I can, although there's more we can do, to try and get this as part of the formation in every American seminary in the United States, because that's what needs to happen. Not that everybody needs to be a trained exorcist, but there needs to be some kind of formation around the issues that we're discussing. I was just on the phone with a guy from the Diocese of Sacramento who I knew when I was in Rome on my sabbatical. Now, Sacramento has an exorcist, and they sent this guy to that exorcist. He prayed over the guy. He felt there was no manifestations, but this guy is making all kinds of claims about what's happening to him. So this young priest calls me, and I know him. So this man's going to come down in a week or so. But he says, the priest, I don't know what to do. I've never seen anything like this, and we never got any of this training in Rome. And I mean, that's true in every single seminary in the United States. So you've got bishops who are afraid in general. That's why a lot of bishops haven't appointed exorcists. They're afraid. There's one diocese in the United States, I won't name, that bishop will not even allow his priest to simply pray deliverance prayers over people out of fear of litigation, which I think is totally off the charts, personally. There's bishops who just flat out believe because they told me so. And I kind of at times scolded them and said, how can you get up and preach on the veracity of the Paschal Mystery if you don't? I said, how can you even do a baptism? And you ask the people, do you reject Satan? And you don't believe this yourself. I said, this is fraudulent. So I think on the one hand, you've got bishops who are afraid of how, because it's controversial. It is, even though, we have a certain amount of credibility in this area. It's controversial, just by the very nature of all the litigiousness going on in the society today. Oh my God, there's one more thing that they have to deal with. So I think as an evangelizing tool, I don't think they would see it as such because of the other sort of variables that are unknown sometimes, but that's fear. That's an opinion. But I give the talks, and then a lot of exorcists, they don't want to be known either, because to be known means people are going to come knocking on your door. Now, at times, it's a curse, figuratively. I get lots of calls. I mean, I could do this full time. And I went and discerned that this last summer on a retreat with priest exorcists at a seminary in Cincinnati. And my own mentor told me before I came home, you do not want to do this full time. You won't survive. This same other priest who was our retreat director, who I have great respect for, he said to me the same thing. He says, you'll burn out. He says, you need to be a marathon runner, not a sprinter. He says, you'll burn out. So that's why I'm not doing it full time. Because I know they're right. But, I mean, I could do this all the time. There's a lot of people who are sick mentally and have nowhere to go. And they've been down the therapy road, oftentimes hasn't worked. They've been to a variety of people, no results. So they turn to the church, not necessarily because they are possessed or they have a demonic issue, but because they don't know what they have. So when people call me and say, Father, I need an exorcism, my pat answer back to them is, I don't do them on demand. It's the last thing you do. Because if you don't know what the hell you're doing, and you exorcise someone who doesn't need it, you can really do major psychological damage to them. So even in the forward of the ritual, it's very clear. The exorcist has to be very deliberate. You need to consult experts in the field, and it must be you must be convinced that is the appropriate approach to take, and that everything else has failed. So that's why they're rare. Even though, as I said, at one point, a few months ago, last year, I was exorcising 5 different people because they all had demonic issues. Well, currently there are 70, approximately. I can name 70 exorcists. I have a confidential list of 70 exorcists in the United States that represent maybe about 65 dioceses. There's probably a few more where the bishop or archbishop has an exorcist but has chosen not to reveal who that person is, or the person himself, who's the exorcist, has not chosen to let us know who they are, maybe because his bishop has asked him not to. We've quadrupled the number of exorcists since the movie came out, so that's a good thing. The challenging part is there's a lot of dioceses that don't even have a protocol. So I, as a result, because I'm public, and I probably wouldn't have been public except for the book and the movie, but because I am so public, I get emails and voicemails from all over the United States and sometimes even outside the country. And what I try and do is connect those people. Like I've had calls from Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia has an exorcist, but he's not on the confidential list. But I happen to know who it is. So when I get calls from Philadelphia, I don't tell them this is the exorcist's email address. What I do is there's an assistant to the exorcist I will call and say, would you be willing to be in touch with so-and-so? Because some dioceses have made it very clear we want to stay below the radar, and I have to respect that. There are some guys who have told me, no problem, just use my email address. But I try and connect people, and if there is nobody in their local church, then I'll try and find the closest diocese that has someone to be able at least to connect them. Because, like at the talk yesterday, it took me an hour to leave. Even though the deacon who gave the talk, one of the talks yesterday, I asked him to kind of run interference for me, because I know when I give these talks, it's there's these people are desperate. Not all of them, but enough of them that even though I finished talking at 12, we did Grace Before Meals. It took me literally an hour. I did not get in my car at 1 o'clock. Well, most mental health folks, clinicians, psychiatrists, are either atheists or agnostics. So it's not only not on the radar, they've chosen it not to be on their radar. So when I've had sometimes people come to me who have been in therapy for a long time, sometimes their own therapists have fired them because they've even brought up the notion of the possibility of could there be a diabolical connection with this? That's why on my team, I'm very lucky. There are dioceses where I've spoken to priests who don't have access to even a Catholic therapist. I says, who do you send people to if people come to either for marriage issues or personal issues? Do you have an array of people? I've always been lucky. In this diocese, this is before I was ever the exorcist, I always had access to Catholics who were in these social science professional fields. Because I want people I'm sending to a healthcare professional to be looking through the same optic as I am, and the people who are going to them are. So what's fortunate about this diocese in terms of this specific ministry, I've got practicing Catholics, the doctor, the psychologist, the psychiatrist, all who believe in the possibility of satanic existence. And that's key. That doesn't mean, therefore, that, there's a bias that, yes, you have a problem, but there's an openness that it's another option. Whereas in most people in the healthcare field, in those roles, it's not only not an option, sometimes they get very combative or defensive if it's even brought up in a therapy session. The only reason I know that, I've had people tell me that, where they're just flat out dismissed. As I said to several who said to me nicely, I just can't believe that this is real. I said, you know what? I'm not here to convince you it is. I'm only here sharing with you what I've experienced. I says, because to believe in the existence of the spiritual realm that we're talking about is really the same thing in believing in the existence of God Almighty. Because I don't think you can have one without the other. So I said, if you choose not to, that's your private business. I can only share with you what I've experienced. Yes, it's based on the teaching of the church, but I'm basing it on eyewitness experiences that I've had. So that's how I've dealt with them. I mean, as I've said, I've had really good relationships with every media person who's ever come and talked to me. And I think in part it's been because I've just been, this is what I've seen. I answer all your questions as directly as I can. And if I don't know something, I'll just tell you I don't know. I would say qualified, some of it probably is. In the few years that I've been exorcist, and prior to that, I didn't know anything. But in the years that I've been doing this, there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of dangerous stuff. And some of these occult activities are no longer really subterranean. I'll give you a couple of examples. A couple towns over from here, there's a New Age bookstore. And a woman who's in my parish came to me about a year ago. And she wasn't in the parish at the time, but she was a Catholic and she was going to another parish. I don't even remember now what drew her into going to that bookstore and signing up for a meditation camp in the wine country. And she started buying all kinds of products from this New Age bookstore. So when she came to me, she told me, I went to this meditation camp. I've been buying things at this store, and I've had a lot of disturbances in my house. I said, get rid of all that stuff. I'll come over and I'll exorcise your home, but get rid of it all. Now, the reason that I used the rite of exorcism of a place was really more precautionary. And so when I went over there, I didn't per se, there weren't things flying around the room, or there wasn't scratches on the wall, there wasn't anything that was, there was no signs. But there is a rite you can use, and I did it really as a precaution. A few weeks after I was over at the house, she called me and she said, there's something I need to show you. So she came over with her son, and they pulled out of a bag this fairy. It was a statue of what was a fairy, but her son had broken this object, as is one of the things they were getting rid of. And when he broke it, it was acrylic material. It wasn't porcelain and it wasn't plastic, but it was something other than that. Out came this altar, a little marble altar with a statue of a headless priest, and hands glued to the altar and other little things all glued to what appeared to be an altar that was used for satanic worship. And somebody had to have built that little altar and everything into the form of that fairy. Otherwise, they would never have even known that thing was in there. And I mean, it was the most creepy thing I ever saw. So I took some exorcised holy water and I performed the rite of exorcism on it on the spot. And then ever since then, I've just become much more vigilant about, when people call me and say, we're having disturbances in our home, blah, blah, blah. I will ask them some questions, but I don't get into things too deep on the phone. I go out and I will just usually perform the rite of exorcism of a place. And I'll ask them a few more questions like, how old is this house? How long have you lived here? Have you done any kinds of things that would have brought something maybe spiritually? And whether it be a demon, although more often than not, it's not a demon, where people will describe what sounds to me like a ghost, which I refer to as a disembodied spirit, where somebody might have died in that house, or there might have been a crime that occurred in that house, or in our valley, this was the valley up until up until the 40s was largely all orchards for the most part. And you had Native Americans living here. And there have been times when people have said, we went down and we talked to the city manager and we found out where this house is was a bunch of burial ground. Well, we even had a disturbance at one of our Catholic cemeteries that I was called to perform the rite of exorcism in a house that the diocese owned. And it was on the property of the cemetery. So, there's a lot of people, to answer your question directly, there's a lot of people doing a lot of dangerous stuff, and it's becoming not so subterranean anymore. It's becoming much more accepted. I looked in Sunset View magazine. They publish in Menlo Park, which is 15 minutes from here. I was waiting to see my chiropractor. I opened the magazine. It was a couple months ago. It was the October edition. I just happened to turn the page, and here's an ad for if you want to have a good time at your Halloween party, bring a medium and get some Ouija boards, and you can really have a blast. I'm reading that stuff going, are those people nuts? I would never have honestly believe that until I actually started dealing with a number of people where they hadn't done anything, but the demonic attachment was passed down through generational lines. In the scriptures, it says that these things can happen going back 4 generations. And so there's renunciation prayers that you have them pray. It doesn't mean you have to do a formal exorcism per se, unless it's really required. And very often what they're suffering from is really not a possession. It can be kind of an oppression of sorts where they either have dreams, a lot of dreams that have to do with the demonic or demonic violence, or a sense of something around them or something in their home. And all of this, sometimes you have to flush this out. This is what takes so much time. And then, if dad or mom were into the occult, and they know it, or grandma and grandpa, which is not unusual, especially in certain cultures, then you go back 4 generations and you have them renounce whatever occurred going back 4 generations, and you pray deliverance prayer over them, and then you kind of see what happens, and then you might have to repeat it, depending. Well, I think the gateway sins, if you're gonna, if you're gonna categorize them, I think anybody who dabbles in paganism and idolatry, all of the occult stuff and things I didn't even mention, I think that's a gateway. The demonic is not synonymous with the occult is not synonymous with the demonic. In other words, the occult does not equate the demonic. The occult is a doorway to the demonic. So a person who plays the Ouija board one time, and they're 15 years old, Is a demon going to come? I doubt it. Highly doubt it. But if that person gets very good at playing the Ouija board and they're still doing it 2 or 3 or 4 years later and they're doing it with any kind of frequency, I'd say the chances of an invitation go up much higher. It's the same thing with people who will dabble in the occult and be sexual abuse victims. That's like putting a bowl of blood outside your back door and waiting for the raccoons to show up. Because demons are always looking for people with broken relationships or no relationships. So certainly the occult, certainly the satanic. Now, I pray over 2 satanic cult survivors every month. They've educated me in a whole world, in the underbelly of our society and culture I knew nothing about. I would say those would be the most obvious doorways, but sexual abuse is actually a doorway too. Now, because someone has been, say, molested or abused at, a prepubescent age, or, and when they're 2 years old, or even if they're a teenager, that doesn't mean that there's going to come a demon. That tends to come when you mix the occult and you're an abuse victim already. But I would say when people come in and they bring that up, first thing I say to them is, have you gone to therapy? Have you gotten some healing for this? Because unless you close that door, it does make you more vulnerable. It makes you more vulnerable for all kinds of things, but it certainly would make you more vulnerable for that. I mean, there's a course in Chicago. It's a conference, which I go to most years. It's been in existence about 8 years. But it's not just for exorcists, and they don't do hands-on kind of training. Although I've told the person who runs it, I like the way this thing works, but you gotta have something just for us who are exorcists as well. Now, in the Diocese of Tulsa, they've started something just for exorcists, and they've done it now 2 years in a row. And I haven't been able to go, unfortunately. But no, if I hadn't had my apprenticeship in Rome, no. Not to do what I'm doing at the level I'm doing it, because I'm getting a lot of complicated cases. And, even as a pastor, and I think this isn't just true in our Catholic tradition. I think anybody who's a religious, spiritual leader of a community, you kind of have to be entrepreneurial. You need to know a lot, and you need to know a little about a lot. And you need to know, when you don't know something, who do you go to? So, guys are calling me sometimes from around the country saying, I was just appointed, what do I do? So I tell them, there's the course in Rome. That has limits. Now what they've done in the course in Rome, they've added a week where you actually go out and observe exorcisms, which is what I was doing, but I did it on my own. And I had a hard time finding Carmen. He was not an easy person to find. And originally, he did not want to take me. I had to convince him that I was the real deal, because I was a voice on the phone speaking broken Italian to him. He's like, who is this guy? So when he agreed to see me, and I brought my letter, and he looked at the letter, it was in English, and he looked at me, and he said, okay, come tomorrow. So I was fortunate, because if he had said no, then I was supposed to go study Spanish in Salamanca after my time in Rome. And so the reason I ended up staying all those extra months was because I needed to learn how to do this, and he was willing to take me on. So I'm grateful to him. But how they do exorcisms in Italy is very different than how they do exorcisms in the United States. And I got into a big argument at the bishop's meeting 2 years ago when there was a subcommittee on canonical affairs. They decided to have a workshop before the semi-annual meeting, and 70 bishops showed up or sent representatives. So there were about 50 bishops there, and then the exorcist of Chicago and this other guy who ran this retreat, who's the smartest priest I've ever met. They were the presenters, and there were a bunch of us exorcists there. So something came up, and so I remember standing up and talking about my experience in Italy. Well, there was a guy from Italy there who I didn't say anything that was disrespectful about Carmen, but who took great umbrage. And so we got into a bit of a tense conversation in front of all the bishops about what are the protocols in our country. I mean, at one point, I can remember Carmen taking his stole, which was around the neck of this person, pulling it together and slapping the guy. And the other exorcist who was with me oftentimes was a guy from Indianapolis, who's the exorcist of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. So we would get on the bus and come home and decompress on the way home. I said, if we did that, we'd be in jail. There's no way. But in Italy does things differently. Italy doesn't have discernment like we do either. I'm not saying, what they're doing is wrong or bad. It's just different. I think you'd have to look at each one of those cases on an individual basis. When the two young men who committed that heinous crime at Columbine, I wasn't the exorcist at the time, but I preached at my parish that weekend at all the masses and talked about it as a diabolical event, not knowing until later that both of those kids had been heavily involved in the occult and had an altar of worship in the home of one of them. That only found out that much later. When the congresswoman was shot and almost killed down in Arizona, CNN and somebody else called me and asked me to weigh in on it. I said, I wanted to know whether or not I thought it was demonic. I said, I would need to know a lot more before I could make any kind of comment. The kid who did that, who just slaughtered the 26 in Newtown, Adam Lanza. I read one account. Somebody sent me something, an email, in which there was an article written back east about Adam Lanza's involvement with the occult, but they can't verify that. But I would say each case would have to be taken separately. I wouldn't say that if they had been involved in the occult or the demonic, that could not have led to mass killings. On the other hand, I couldn't say outright that every one of those things was inspired demonically. I've never had a lot of hands-on experience with a medium. A medium could be, honestly, anybody who just starts communicating with what they think is a spirit. I mean, it doesn't have to be somebody who's got a shingle outside their door. Because sometimes when people have come to me and they says, Father, I do talk to spirits. I says, first of all, you got to stop doing that. I says, because you're becoming a medium. You don't want to do that because you don't know how you might be opening yourself up to something you don't even know what you're opening yourself up to. So, you've got some people who, as you say, are fakes, and these guys all get paid for doing this stuff. For somebody who thinks of themselves as legitimate and at the same time believes in Jesus, I've had people come to me who've told me that they've been to mediums who actually, as you say, believe in God and all that. To me, it's antithetical. I don't see how you can be a medium and believe in God at the same time, personally. Now, I don't know who this person is, so I'm not trying to judge them if they believe in their heart that they can commune, I would just say what they're doing is highly dangerous. Because it's called divination, and you're replacing God with other gods. That's against the first commandment. And the Jews did this. The Israelites did this. In the book of Deuteronomy, there's all kinds of places where they were doing this kind of stuff. So they had exorcisms in the Old Testament. So this wasn't just a Jesus thing. They had exorcisms in the Old Testament, but his reason for coming had directly to do with the defeat of Satan. Why? Because of the fall of man from grace. It goes back to Genesis. So I just think people who are tapping into that, I think what I can say objectively, it's dangerous. And they're really practicing a form of divination by doing it, and that is offensive to the first commandment. I think I can say that fairly. It doesn't mean that, if someone is being sincere, I'm not here to condemn those folks. But I just think, A, it's dangerous. And if somebody goes to somebody who claims to be medium, I just think they're just setting themselves up for potential problems. Because how do you know where this man, who's he been communicating with? Has he been in touch with a demon? Did he go to a witch? Did he go to a warlock? Who is this guy? I mean, as I said, people do a lot of dangerous stuff. Paganism is on the rise. It just is. it happened in kind of an accidental way, and I don't believe in accidents, so I think it was providential. In '04, John Paul mandated every bishop in the world to select and train a priest to be an exorcist. Now, it has been a common practice for dioceses for hundreds of years to have an exorcist, usually someone who has been secretly appointed by the bishop, and it's usually not someone who anyone really knows other than the bishop and the person who's the exorcist. So in '04, when this happened, I didn't know anything about this. It wasn't until 2005 when our bishop decided to take that mandate seriously, of which at that time I didn't even know there was a mandate, because we were getting calls, the bishop was getting calls in this diocese from people requesting exorcisms or claiming that they needed assistance of this kind. So the bishop approached the priest, who's one of my very closest priest friends, and who has a doctorate in spirituality from Catholic University, and who was just getting ready to start and launch what's called Spirit Site, which is a spirituality center. And he's in my priest support group. So he brings us to our meeting, and part of our priest support group monthly meeting is sharing the scriptures, adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and then we have what's called the Reveal of Life, where we each bring an event. So Kevin brings this event. The bishop wants me to be the exorcist. So we all said, do it. You're qualified. You've got this doctorate. You're starting a spirituality center. You have the location where these things could happen, blah, blah, blah. So a month later, he comes back and says, I've decided against it. So I spoke up very naively and just said, I could be the exorcist. I believe in the personification of evil. This is word for word. I could do that job. So Kevin went to the bishop and said, I'm not willing to, but he is. So then the bishop, PJ, his nickname, says to me, well, you're going to Rome in a few months to start your sabbatical. There's a course you can take in Rome. So that's how it happened. And so once I'm taking the course, and there were about 60 people in the course, mostly Italian priests and African nuns, and then 3 Americans, me, Matt Ballio, the writer of the book, and then this third priest, who unfortunately has since died of Lou Gehrig's disease. The priest who was the priest who died of Lou Gehrig's disease was working in sort of an apprenticeship position, which I eventually did, at a chapel next to St. John Lateran Basilica called the Scala Santa, and there was an 85-year-old priest in there every day performing exorcisms, and this priest, Johannes, a Franciscan, was apprenticing under him. So he'd come to class on Thursdays, and he'd say, this is what's going on. And so I remember saying to both the priest and Matt, I got to go find somebody. I don't know. I haven't got the foggiest idea what I'm supposed to do. So between Cardinal Leveda and Matt Ballio and Johannes, I was eventually able to get Father Carmen. And so that's how it all happened. So I went out 3 days a week for 3.5 months, for 3 hours at a crack, took the bus, went out to St. Lawrence outside the walls, and would sit and observe and pray as he was praying, the Rite of Exorcism. I'd have the ritual on my lap, and I would be observing him perform exorcisms. I think the movie was very on target. I worked on the set with Anthony Hopkins for a week in Budapest. The critics panned the movie in part, some of the movie, because they felt that the girl who was impregnated as a result of incest, that those movements were unreasonable. Those were not possible. Those are possible. And I worked on that. When I was on that set with Michael Nordstrom, he kept saying to me, what do you think? What do you think? And I kept saying, what she's doing is very legitimate, even though it was acting. Because when a demon is attached, or a possession, which is rare as opposed to an attachment, the demonic is going to do anything it wants to your body, things that you wouldn't normally be able to do. And that's why when I was reading these critics, I was going, they don't know what they're talking about, because they've never really actually seen one. But in fact, in Rome and here, there are situations where the demon will be able to contort a body in ways that the person wouldn't normally be able to contort. And so, both in Rome and in here, when you compare it to the movie, for example, I have at one point 6 months ago, I was exorcising 5 different people. Presently, I'm exorcising one of those 5. 2 of those 5, we were able to deliver. One of those individuals I had to stop because she made accusations against a priest who had sent her to me, and accusations against me, although the ones against me she didn't put in writing. The ones against this other priest she did. They had to put him in mothballs for a month to do an investigation. So I said, I can't deal with this. There's no way. But it really wasn't her. It was the demonic. In the other situation, that poor guy has demonic problems, but he can only handle so much at a time. And we've been exorcising him for about a year, and he can't take any more right now. So we're in touch with him. We pray for him all the time. So the one that I am continuing to see, those demonic manifestations are the most ferocious that I've ever dealt with, where it requires, for example, 5 grown men to hold him down.